So as you can see, we have some progress happening here on the 38. Most of what we're looking at is construction grade plywood, which of course we're not going to build the boat with. We are using mahogany and other boat specific woods. But I wanted to kind of show what our milestone 1 process is and what some of the different things are for it. So on a project this size, it makes sense to take large chunks and kind of break down milestones. And we've done that on this boat. What we identified as, for us, major milestones in the road to completing this project. And one of the first milestones is nearly complete. And it's basically doing mock-ups and answering questions. That's kind of how we're identifying it. Because this boat was so empty and there wasn't a lot of information and we don't have a lot of old parts, and it was modified at some point, we believe once in the 40s or 50s and once again in the 70s. There isn't really a lot of original stuff, material here in the boat to go off of to recreate it. And because it's such a rare boat, there aren't that many that we can go out and look at. What we have been able to do, though, is collect lots of different photos and measurements from other boats that exist out there, as well as get some historical information from the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. So what we're looking at around me is obviously construction grade plywood, OSB, not what we're going to build the final product out of. But I wanted to take a minute and talk about milestone 1 and what that means for us on this project and what we're doing with all this construction grade lumber. So the first thing I'll point out is, again, to identify our milestone 1, answering questions. A lot of the questions we had to answer was what kind of structure was used to assemble the boat, what pieces went in first, how does the cabin reattach, what were the heights and dimensions of the major components of the boat, even down to things like what was the crown on the bridge deck, what was the radius of that, would be a more common mathematical term. What's the size of the after cockpit, where do the seats go and what size are they, all that sort of stuff. A lot of questions of that nature to ask. One of the other questions that we had regarding the cabin is it in the right shape? It's one of the most original pieces of the boat that we have, and it's been very degraded and very modified over the years. So in order to put it back to a true restoration, got to determine what it's supposed to be in order to put it back to. So there's been a lot of research, a lot of looking at photos, a lot of contacting others that have worked on similar projects, and just generally gathering information and working through the process of answering these questions. Part of that is going to be doing this full-scale mock-up that I'm sitting in right now. So full-scale mock-ups are used by both new boat builders and by restorers, and also at production boat companies. There are certain answers that you can get to your questions that you can really best get with a full-size mock-up. I'll show in a minute how we got some of the dimensions for this stuff, but at the scale we're working at on a small drawing, it's really easy to have a scaling error or to have a measurement error, or you're working off a photo or an old magazine article or something of that nature. It's really hard to get it to where it needs to be, and this allows us to dial it in perfectly. Also, 2 more considerations for the reason we do the mock-up. One of them is there were several submodels of this boat. Of the set of plans that we were able to get from the Mariners Museum, it shows a couple of different variations. And you'll remember from a couple videos ago, I had mentioned the production run continuing into 1930 and 31 with the Model 122 and the Model 276, and what we have is a Model 16. So any of the drawings that we've received that say Model 122 or 276, it's not that we can't use them, but they're not the most accurate drawings for this boat. Now, other than interior arrangement, there really weren't that many modifications, so there are some information I was able to pull off those other plans in order to help us get these dimensions and build this thing out. But it gives us a really good feel for where things are supposed to be, making choices such as the aft cockpit would be a great one. This is where I'm sitting right now and where most of the different variations were in the different designs. The way the seat boxes worked, the way the step worked, the way the storage worked, if at all. Some models didn't have it at all. So we're able to play with those dimensions and see what it feels like in real time. The other reason to do it is because we are adding a lot of mechanical systems into this boat that aren't original. When this boat was designed, it was designed for a Chris Craft A70. and a gearbox and shaft and quadrant style steering system. And it was designed for 186 gallons of fuel, and on and on and on. So because we're significantly modifying all that stuff with modern equipment, we have to rebuild new tanks, we have to add different batteries, we have a different style engine. There's enough of that stuff that we, in a sense, have to redesign based on the hull that we already have. That's one of the reasons we did the longitudinal center of gravity, or center of buoyancy calculation. With a setup like this, I can see what the engine hatch size is, I can see what the access to the engine room size is as it was designed. I can measure now in there very easily and see if I can fit the engine I want. I can even arrange tanks and stuff in there. If we wanted to, we could build, and we may do it, a plywood fuel tank. That's going to be the dimensions, a mock-up, a box of the fuel tank. We can put it in there and make sure that we can get it in and get it out. I'm a big fan of not designing yourself into a box or into a corner. And we have that opportunity since we have an empty hull, so we can make it look as original as possible and put the modern, safe, and requested equipment in the boat and make it perform as necessary. So one way we've been able to grab these dimensions and play with some of the different shapes is with the plans that we did receive from the Mariners Museum. Now these were scanned from the Chris Craft archive, and it is not a complete set of plans. I'm sure there were a lot more construction drawings that were never saved to the archive, things that the draftsmen were putting together and sending down to the shop floor to have things put together on the prototype hull. Some of these drawings that we have are reproduced of revisions from different models, stuff like that, but there is a lot of information on here we can grab. Now, I had mentioned in a previous video that I had scanned all these into AutoCAD, and that's been really helpful because there's scaling errors for sure on how many times this paper has been reproduced, and no doubt it was printed from a PDF. But we were able to scan them and put them in AutoCAD and scale it to match the hull that we have right here, which is 38 feet 1 inch. So based on that, we're now able to go in and trace shapes using the 2D line work in AutoCAD and make measurements of very specific things, and then go check it on the boat and make sure that it makes sense. I was actually very pleasantly surprised at how accurate a lot of the dimensions turned out to be as we were pulling things back. For instance, the distance between the bow and this aft bulkhead. Was able to pull a tape from the bow all the way back, ask AutoCAD what the distance was on the plan that we had scaled, and based on that, we were within like 1/4 of an inch of where it's supposed to be. Well, that tells me a couple things. First of all, that tells me I can trust the drawing, and it can tells me that I can trust the AutoCAD scaling feature. So because of that, we're able to make a lot of other suppositions about things. Getting the deck crown, I'll show you some of the other drawings in a deep dive video, but some of the other dimensions we've been able to pick up: length of the aft cockpit, deck crown, size of the hatch, what's the dimensions of the planking for the decking, what are the widths of the covering boards, what are the heights of the combings. We actually have enough information that we can pull off of that, and if we wanted to, make a full-size pattern. And if we really wanted to, we're not going to because it's overkill for this, we could have it CNC cut. We're going to do it by hand, and we're going to do it as necessary on the boat, but the point is we're able to pull way more information off of these than you might think. So some of the dimensions we were able to pick up were things like the height and the length of this aft cockpit area. Now there's going to be a seat box that sits back here, kind of like the third cockpit on a triple cockpit runabout, although a little bit bigger. Some of the other information we were able to find is what's the height of this step. This section right here is actually independent from the bridge deck. It's a step up. This was a point of contention between those of us here in the shop because depending on which pictures and which plans we looked at, there's a lot of conflicting information between the existing boats and the existing plans. Well, anytime there's a point of contradiction like that, it also kind of means we have a little bit of free will. So we mocked up the one that we think makes the most sense to us, makes it the best height with which to step off of the dock onto the boat. That's a really good access point for both sides. The step's a little high, but we can deal with that, and that does step us up to bridge deck height. Now there's going to be a big built-in seat right there and one right there. That is an access down to where the transmission will live, and there's our engine hatch. And we did determine that our engine that we're looking at will fit down in there. And we're also finding out that all of our fuel tanks and stuff will fit the way we expect also. So all the good reasons to do that mock-up. You'll also notice our bilge paint is complete. It's very nice to have that all done, get a little bit better light in the cabin, and kind of continue on with that. Another example of answering a question is trying to sort out what exactly happened here with this cabin roof. So this cabin rooftop collapsed. You can see there's a kind of a big flat spot in it. It's sunken down. That happened a long time ago, and part of that was because the original structure of that cabin roof had failed. So that was either a rotten wood issue due to lack of maintenance, probably part of that, and also Chris Craft didn't really design that as strong as they could have and probably should have. So one of the things we have to do is get the cabin roof shape back in order. And we had some questions as to how to do that. We are putting in temporary beams underneath, and I'll show those in a second, but here's an example of where AutoCAD really shines. We were able to copy off of the drawing the cabin roof profile and then make a pattern that we can actually stand up along the center line, and wherever the gap is where it has dropped. And this has turned out to be remarkably accurate as well. There's reasons why we believe the forward part of this cabin roof has not suffered any structural damage. It's because of all the cabinetry and bulkheads that still exist up there. So being able to use something like this, we can now set this up a little bit more permanently along the center line, a little less flimsy, and get inside and using jacks, push the cabin rooftop back up where it belongs. Once it's back in the shape that it's supposed to be in, we can add temporary structure to hold everything together until we can have the structural framing done to support. That also involves removing old repairs. This hull has been through lots, and it's really easy to be critical about the methods that were used to restore it / repair it / preserve it. But the fact of the matter is, as much as we might criticize those methods today, they did keep the boat here for a long time. So at some point, the cabin sustained a bunch of damage. They replaced this aft bulkhead with plywood. That was a no-no. They replaced this with plywood, and they coated everything with fiberglass. That was after they took 2x4 construction grade lumber and shoved that in there, and that's what supported the deck beams, and some of the deck beams were sawn in order to make that repair. And so this was a whole big mess, and this was done with fiberglass and polyester resin back in the day. So part of what we're doing to correct that shape is to take off just some of the rooftop planking in this location so we can access the structure for this. That also loosens up the cabin top enough that we can push it back into the shape that it belongs in order to actually make those structural repairs. And then as we rebuild the cabin sides and the decking, we can get this stuff set back up the way it belongs to. So part of it is taking it a little bit further apart in order to get it back together in the right shape. So looking up, we can see this is the cabin roof structure in the forward part of the cabin where it's supported really well by all this strong cabinetry. And these deck beams have not collapsed, which again is why we believe that the rooftop is correct in that shape. But when we look further back, there really isn't any structure holding it in place. So one of the things that we've done is just make these temporary beams to kind of support that and hold that fabric of the roof together until we can push it back up where it belongs. And you can see I can just lift it basically right there. So that's going to be helpful as we move forward. And of course, as we frame this aft bulkhead, that's really going to provide support for the cabin structure as well and allow us to get back symmetrical. It is definitely not symmetrical right now. It's really floppy. There's a lot of rotten wood, but there are some elements we're trying to keep, so it's not just a wholesale redo. Anyway, that's our update on milestone 1, where we're at so far with answering all those questions and where we got some of the data. I am going to do a deeper dive video into the research that we've done on this boat and why all that matters, so stay tuned for that. But that's where we're at with determining our situation on the aft cockpit, the bridge deck, and the cabin roof. There's much more to figure out up front, which we're in the process of, and I'll bring you along for that when we got more to tell.